On today's podcast,
It's the idea of natural talent has to meet resilience and perseverance and keep doing it.
the truth is, adding value will never go out of style.
This podcast is brought to you by iWatch Security. iWatch Security. Get the savings and service that you deserve.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for another Five Things podcast. I've got a great guest today, Jeni Snider, Jeni with an I, ESQ here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
First, give a little background here. Jeni just did my living will, my will, set up a trust, and we just executed that today with a couple glorious witnesses here to visualize that. Now we're on video, so it's official. So thank you for that. Had a great experience. We'll just start off by saying that. And I knew it was going to be a good experience from the first time we met. And so if you don't mind sharing some stuff with us, where are you from originally?
I'm from New York City originally.
Okay. New York City.
Yes.
All right.
I don't think I have an accent, but I think everyone says that.
No, not much. So grew up in New York City, and parents, I just know this from knowing you, parents came here originally from?
They're originally from the Soviet Union.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you couldn't come directly to the U.S. back then. So you had to kind of go through Poland or...
Kind of wiggled their way into the country.
Exactly. Yes.
But it's to me, it's a great story because they got here and they just kind of worked their way up, right? They just kind of gutted it out and created a great situation for you and your brother, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely grew up with that American dream mentality, and you can do whatever you want. Hard work pays off. Great work ethic. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And she's got a great Russian accent imitation that we won't get into today, but I just want to share that that's definitely existing.
Yeah.
So
Russian grandmas.
Right. Grew up in New York City until when?
Well, I went to college in New Hampshire at 18, and then back and forth to New York, and then California for law school, back to New York, Connecticut, and then I've been down here in North Carolina for the last 10 years.
Okay, Berkeley for college.
For law school.
For law school, okay. Let me ask you this: what's because a lot of our content is geared towards helping people kind of learn from our mistakes, right, and try to become. Wisdom is gained through mistakes. Unfortunately, a lot of times, like you get wisdom from. I actually heard this morning on a podcast I was listening to as well. Confidence comes from mistakes a lot of times. So it's like you do something enough time and you make mistakes. So you might really stink at it initially, but you learn each time you do it, and that's where confidence comes from. So same thing with wisdom. Unfortunately, you do something once and you learn from it. What is something, if you could go back in time and talk to young Jeni getting ready to graduate high school and go off to college, what would you tell her?
I would tell her exactly that every master was once a disaster, right? People say that all the time. And resilience, that Angela Duckworth, I believe her name is, has that book, Grit. Those things weren't around when I was 18 years old. And so learning by trial and error to have grit and have perseverance and resilience, getting the support that you need and the education that you need around sort of adulting. And I think that is lacking in our community. And certainly in estate planning, and we'll get to that later, but a lot of the mistakes that people make really comes from a lack of knowledge around, sort of what it takes to be an adult. And, it's hard. My kids want to grow up fast, but the truth is it gets complicated.
And I and this is probably a whole nother podcast, but I just think there's so many things that aren't taught in school that are realistically like credit or all of these things that are super relevant that we never talked about in school. And it's like, why?
Yeah, I don't use the calculus I used to be able to do in my head.
Right.
I don't even know what calculus is used for, and I had 2 years of it. I really believe that, and I almost want to be part of that change. I try to educate. I run a very education-based practice to educate people around their choices, and because I think that is something that's lacking. Taxes and like you said, credit. I mean, people don't even realize that no credit is just as bad, if not worse, than bad credit.
Right.
So just establishing that early and getting the mentorship, I think, is the biggest thing that 18-year-old Jeni, needed, I think, is especially having foreign parents who they themselves didn't really know the system and the best way to do things. And so really just learning to seek out the experts in their field, whether it's in tax, attorneys, bookkeeping, CPAs, credit, all of that, so that you really set yourself up for success early and not have to maybe make some of the same mistakes over and over, not reinventing the mistake wheel, so to speak.
Sure. Well, let me ask you this one last thing, because I know you've read a lot of books, and you've definitely, I can tell you're into growth and self-growth. Is there a book or a podcast or something that really made an impact on you that would be good for someone coming up in life? Is there something that jumps out at you?
Honestly, I think that book, Grit,
Okay.
really stands out for me, because it's the idea of natural talent has to meet resilience and perseverance and keep doing it. You can't slack off. It sort of reminds me of the child who's really good at math naturally, and then at some point in school it gets too hard, and suddenly they have to sit on their butt and actually study it. There are a lot of people who just can't do that. They've never developed that skill and that muscle. And sometimes having less natural talent and more ability, or a higher ability, to actually sit down and learn it the hard way, through blood, sweat, and tears, ultimately become more successful down the line.
Sure. Well, you got to learn to pay the price.
Yeah.
And if success was easy, everybody'd be successful. Yep. If developing wealth was easy, everybody'd be wealthy. It takes discipline, and to your point, it takes grit. Sounds like a good book. So you go off to Berkeley. What were some of your couple memories that you can share on a video
About law school?
Yeah, what was something that stuck out to you?
We had really
about
great
that
Halloween
experience?
parties.
Yeah.
That's a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I
Yeah.
graduated back in 2000.
Yeah.
Back then, it was the first .com bubble out in Northern California and San Francisco. So it was a
Okay.
great time to be there. We actually got lots of snow in Tahoe, lots of snowboarding, and
Right.
really being able to connect with very interesting people who were doing really, cutting edge stuff at that time. So I would say that really stands out in my head.
And so back then
As
it was
well.
like the World Wide Web was kind of a new thing. It's hard for a lot of people to probably comprehend that.
Yeah.
But the World Wide Web, it was like, how are you going to sell wine on the internet? And it's like everything's bought on the internet now. And so just a couple little things, kind of funny things growing up is that, I was told never get in the car with a stranger. And when the first www came along, it's like you never put your credit card on the internet. Now it's like you put your credit card on the internet and you're getting an Uber for your kid to go somewhere. It's like so many things change, so that's something that's, it's funny growing up. Things that you may believe now may change.
Absolutely. And I think too, like to your point about, getting into a car with strangers, that's actually one of the biggest lessons I'm trying to teach my children now is why, my 11-year-old just asked for a webcam. Well, Mom, sometimes I want to do videos or I want to talk to my friends. And it's like, well, I'm saying no because I'm trying to keep you safe. And so there is a little bit of that technology meets predators, making it
Sure.
easier in a lot of ways. So,
no
so really trying to keep safe and even your credit cards, things like that. Listen, back when I was in college, my college ID number was my social security number. It was actually on my ID card. We would never do that today. Right?
And it's
we
funny,
live and learn.
you just reminded me about this. In the military, our social was spray painted on our duffel bag when they first issued it. You're walking around with your social on your bag, just insane.
Yeah.
But, we live and we learn, right?
But we also didn't worry as much about fraud like that.
Right.
I think the internet with its anonymity, really, where people can hide behind screens and, all this dark web stuff that I really don't understand. You can really steal someone's identity and do a lot of damage. Whereas I think
Right.
back in our day, it was local, right? Only the person looking at your duffel is going to even see that. And then it would have to be somebody who had sort of nefarious intentions, exactly.
And skills. Being in your law practice for quite a while now, you've been in the Triangle for how long has it been?
I've been here for 10 years.
10 years.
But I was not licensed in North Carolina until a couple of years ago. So I started my practice
Okay.
a few years ago. Mhm.
Awesome. So kind of jumping into that, obviously we're here to talk about some of the things that you need to think about when it comes to wills, living wills, trusts, things like that. And I told Jeni before we started, I said, I got a story I want to tell, but I want to tell it live. I don't want you thinking about it. But this is a true story. And so when my mother found out that she had cancer, basically, definitely the toughest phone call I ever took. but ended up flying out that week to go back to Phoenix, where she was married to Fred. And we went back to Phoenix and basically spent a week together. And some of the things we talked about were very serious topics because it was stage 4 lung and brain cancer.
Oh my goodness.
And so there was a very realistic possibility that she wasn't going to make it through, and she didn't, God rest her soul. But we sat there and we talked with me, Fred, and my mom, and we kind of talked about everything and what this and what that. And one of the things that came up was the house where they lived was originally my great-grandmother's house. And my great-grandmother had been there. My grandmother was there for a period, and then my mom lived there for a while. So kind of a sentimental house. And they had built onto it and put a pool in and done some different things, and it was a nice little house in Phoenix. And so we all discussed it, and I said, well, I'd love to keep the house in the family. I said, it's not really the money. It's just the house was very sentimental to me because my mother and my grandmother were probably 2 of the closest people in my life. So anyway, very clear, the will was going to be drawn up, opened a P.O. box, put the will in the P.O. box at a Wells Fargo in Phoenix, Arizona. Any case, long story short is my mother ends up passing. And I guess it was about a year or 2 down the line, about a year and a half, 2 years down the line, I called up Fred because I was going to go in town and visit and just, Fred, I'm going to be in town visiting friends and this and that. And he was, I could tell something was a little off, something was different. I think being in sales, just you kind of like, something is a little amiss here. And he wasn't sure he'd be able to get together. Anyway, long story short, for the sake of the time on the podcast, he told me the house was for sale. And I mean, there was a will. It's in the P.O. box. The house is mine. Okay. So I basically said, wow, that's okay. I didn't want to come across as too aggressive, but I'm like, I need to get to Arizona and I need to get my hands on this will. I get to Phoenix, Arizona, go straight to Wells Fargo. The P.O. box was closed. There is no will. Fred sold the house and he moved and he got remarried and he lives in Florida now. And so it's not even the money. It was just, that was a 20-something year friendship of someone who I would have gone through walls for, that just outright very good friend of mine is an attorney in Arizona. I was talking to him and he's not your background, but at the end of the day, you got to have this kind of stuff, in my opinion, and certainly in your opinion and anybody who's had to deal with this, but you got to make sure you got your hands on it as well. So anyway, I just wanted to share that story to kind of preface what you're getting ready to go into, because I've had friends that have been through probate. I've seen some of this, and it's in part, I think I'm generally, being in the security industry, I'm pretty proactive. Being a dad, I've had life insurance for almost all my life. I'm just very proactive when it comes to a lot of this kind of stuff. But I just want to share that with you because I'm sure you've heard all kinds of horror stories like that. And at the end of the day, my trusting nature, you just can't trust people. You got to have your ducks in a row. So I'll tee it up with that.
Honestly, what you just said is exactly why I encourage people to plan, and especially in divorce situations, remarriage situations, or life partner situations, where if you want a certain outcome, you definitely need to plan for it. And you need to plan with someone who knows how to deal with those situations, because one of the biggest feedbacks that I get is, oh, I didn't even know to think of that, or I didn't, because you don't know what you don't know. And I've even had attorneys say that to me. Well, why shouldn't I write it like that? Or why shouldn't they do it like this? And it's like, well, because A, B, and C might happen,
right?
And we can all, give hope and pray those things don't happen. But, I think we all know that in this world, nothing is predictable. And so many, scenarios can play out in different ways. And so, if that was supposed to stay in your family, there were different ways that could have and should have happened. Right.
So one of the things you talked about during our signing today is like, you might trust somebody to make that decision or handle it a certain way, but let's get it in writing. Let's make sure your wishes are being executed. And so you didn't even know this story. So it's like, I understand exactly what you're saying at a pretty high level, So, so that being said, I appreciate you sharing your information here today, because everybody really needs to listen to this. If you're 18 or plus, realistically, you're an adult and you need to start planning for stuff. And that, which kind of leads us into our 5 things, if you're ready for it.
I'm ready.
Okay. So number 1, what would you say?
Well, I mean, I think the 5 things would be mistakes that people make, right? When it comes with planning. So I think that in that sort of overarching umbrella, and like a typical lawyer, I have like subpart A and subpart B and little Roman numeral I, and some stories. But I think number 1 is the failure to plan altogether. And there are different reasons for that. The number 1 thing is, I think what you were saying about, being 18, the idea of I'm not old enough. I don't need it yet. I'm young. I'm healthy. I'm fine. And it's something that I can do another time. And I think traditionally we thought of it as something that grandparents did, right? You write a will when you're 80.
Sure.
It's just prudent to do it now, when you are able to, when you have the capacity to do so, when you're healthy, when you have the luxury of thinking about things, thinking through things, and the luxury of speaking to loved ones and people that you would, trust to, let's say, take care of your children, or to pay your bills if you can't, or to make your medical decisions when you can't. Because at the end of the day, that's really what you're planning for as a young person. It's not just where your stuff goes.
Right.
It's not. And I think that if you think about it as just like, oh, my will, like who's going to get my $5,000 bank account, then you may say, well, I don't need to plan for that. Who cares? But it's really more about everything else, about making it as easy as possible for your family, because at the end of the day, they're going to be grieving you, and they're going to be having a hard time, whether, and you're much more likely to be in the hospital, maybe even in and out of consciousness for a while before you pass away. And so you're really trying to just make it as easy for them to know what you would want and how you want things, and to make sure that they have the legal ability to make your medical decisions, to pay your bills, get access to your bank accounts, things like that.
Sure. Well, one of the things, and I hope I'm not diving into your topics, but one of the things that you said today was, a lot of times it's not even about just what you want necessarily. It's about taking the burden off somebody else making a decision, maybe causing infighting between people that love you. One person wants to keep you hooked up to the machine, hoping for some miraculous recovery, while you're bleeding out and putting all this pressure on your family to pay for this. And the other person's just like, I know that Brian wouldn't want to be like this. It's not even about the money. It's just, I know he wouldn't want to be like this. I've jokingly said, to my kids, if you have to change my diaper, like find a way to take me out because I'm ready to go. And I say that joking, but I'm not terribly off pace from that,
Absolutely. That's so true. And that goes along with the whole thing about I'm too young to have to plan. And people love to quote the Terry Schiavo case. And she was 26 years old and had a stroke. She didn't die, but she was in a permanent vegetative state. Her husband wanted her to die a natural death, and said that was what her wishes were. And I believe she actually did have a healthcare power of attorney. Her parents fought it, and they fought it for 10 years. At one point, they even unplugged her, and the parents got a court order to plug her back in. And so it was this very horrible ordeal. And so really, you're never too young to plan. She was 26. And so that is sort of the cautionary tale there, absolutely. And not just age that I think that people don't plan, but also the idea that I don't have an estate yet. I need more money. When I have more, then I'll plan. And I think I've told you before, I have a neighbor who married, 2 young children, owns a house, owns multiple cars, is a veteran, and literally said that to me the other day. Oh my gosh, yes, I'm so glad I know you're an estate planning attorney. When I have an estate, I'll call you. I was like, oh, hold up, you have an estate. Are you alive? Are you breathing? You have an estate. Right. And I think that part of the problem there is the language that we use. Estate, trusts, funding. These are words we tend to use for very wealthy people, Rockefellers, and the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musk's. And it's like, wait, hold up. We're all there. We're all there. If you're living and breathing, then you have an estate. Do you have a bank account? Do you have a job? Do you have a child? Then you actually have assets and people to protect. So, and also just, again, like naming somebody to make your healthcare decisions for you and decide in advance how you want to be treated by your doctors or by your family. So I think the idea of not having an estate or not having enough is an issue. And this unfortunately does end up burdening families. There's a story of a janitor, he had $10,000 in his bank account. His daughter needed to access that money to pay for his housing, and his landlord wanted the money while he's in the hospital. In order for her to access that without any prior planning, she had to go to court. And court equals money,
Court's
delay,
super fast as
and
well.
stress.
I mean, so
Super fast, yeah.
Yeah, so they're going to be evicted probably quicker than they're going to have that resolved.
Well, that takes a long time too.
Yeah, fortunately in that scenario.
Exactly.
But still, lots of aggravation and frustration, whereas had you just planned a little bit ahead,
Absolutely,
you could have had
right.
that taken care of.
Absolutely, some basic planning. I mean, not everybody needs advanced planning for sure. And of course, I like to do comprehensive planning. I mean, all of even my will-based plans are still going to come with the power of attorney and the healthcare documents that you need, because in my mind, someone says, oh, I just need a really simple will. It's very incomplete. The will only comes into play when you've already passed away. And so we are much more likely to have that period of time where we need help with making our decisions, both healthcare and financial, and also with your children. Because if you do have minor children, somebody needs to take care of them. We want them to be kept out of child protective services and out of the foster system, at all costs.
The last thing I want the government doing is getting involved in my decisions for my assets or my kids or any of that, so that just seems like a nightmare to me.
Yes. And at the end of the day, the courts are going to get involved with children. They're sort of the last resort. When you name guardians in your will or in a power of attorney, the court is still going to be the last to decide where your children go, because they are looking at what's truly in the best interest of the children. And if you name somebody who, by the time it's time for them to take your kids they've developed a serious illness or a drug addiction, or they've lost their job, they've lost their home, they've moved to California, things that are maybe not in the best interest of your child at that time, that person is not going to qualify to take your children. And again, thinking about what's best for the kids. And one of the things that I like to do is sort of focus on where plans fail, to be able to make sure that we fill those holes and those gaps for clients. And that's one of them, is just naming one person in your plan to take your children, right? Or make your healthcare decisions. When you name one person, if at the time they're needed, they're not available, they've just been diagnosed with their own disease, they were in the car with you during that accident, whatever it is, you really want to be the person who has named successors, that would come after the person, because otherwise it's the equivalent of not having planned at all. And when you haven't planned, it really is left to the court to make their best guess. And I do believe knowing some clerks of court in this state, and each county, we have 100 counties, each one has their own clerk making these decisions. Knowing them, I do know they have the best interests of these families at heart, but they really are just working on limited information when you haven't provided it for them.
Sure. One of the old sayings is, if you're failing to plan, you're planning to fail. And it's, you're putting the ball out there in someone else's hands. Yeah. Did we officially get into number 2, or we're just wrapping up?
I've got little
Roman numeral
3. A lot of times people don't want to plan because they don't want to think about bad things. Sure. I recently had this. The husband was super gung-ho, like, yes, I want to be able to sleep at night. I want a comprehensive plan. And that's the whole point, right? Let's have these difficult conversations. There are tissues on the table for a reason. Let's get through them if you need to, take a break, fine. But once you get through it and once you sign those documents, then you can go ahead and focus on other things, knowing that you have this in place behind you to make sure those kids or, your family is going to be okay. Even your pets. I mean, let's face it. Let's figure out where they're going to go, right? A lot of times people don't want to do that, right? They're like, nope, I don't want to think about what happens if I don't make it home today. I don't want to think about, my kids not having me there to walk them down the aisle. They just don't want to think about it. And they think it's somehow going to cause these bad things to happen. Yeah. And,
I can see that. I can see that in people. There's a lot of, I'm kind of a curious soul. I like to ask questions. I like to talk about a wide variety of things. And you can tell when people just don't want to think about something. They don't want to talk about something. Obviously, being in the security industry, people are contacting us. We're not out there, throwing stuff in your face. So those folks are more likely to talk about a wide range of things. But I can see just in general conversations with friends, sometimes it's like they don't want to think about certain things. They'd rather just pretend it doesn't exist.
And it goes towards what you were saying earlier about adulting and about what we don't learn in high school, right? We don't learn. By the time we hit 18, we should all be signing these basic documents and giving at least our parents the permission to speak to doctors, because legally they don't have that automatic ability to do so.
Right.
They just don't. And you need to give it to them at 18. So I think that the idea that we don't want to think about it, I don't have to think about it, or I'll think about it tomorrow. And then the next thing you know, it's too late. And, I don't want to, I can tell you, just like in security, you can tell horror stories all day long. I can tell you about the stories where the dad dies and 3 weeks later the mom dies after, and now the 2-year-old child has nowhere to go and no plan in place. So it gives me goosebumps to think about these things, but these things are realities. They happen all the time. And I think, going into sort of the failure to plan, I think that to sort of conclude on number one is that you actually do have a plan. If you haven't planned, the state has a plan for you. It's basically what is your legal plan as soon as you're born. The state has created a plan on what we do for people when they can't make their own decisions financially and medically. Children as minors automatically are considered sort of incapacitated, right, to make their own decisions until you're 18. But we have a plan. And, I'm always saying, if you know what it is, you probably don't want that to be your plan. And so the number one thing is to be educated around what that looks like, because if you're married in North Carolina, if you have parents who are alive or children, your spouse does not get 100% of the assets automatically. It just doesn't work that way. And if your kids are minors, then now you have to be a guardian over their assets that they've inherited, and they get everything outright, unprotected at 18 years old. And in addition, whether you have a will or not, all that information is public once you're in probate. And so some people do want to avoid probate, avoid that public record, and that's where people are creating the revocable living trust, because really what that is it's a probate avoidance tool.
And so you're dodging or helping to dodge potential predators and things like that by having a trust, if I remember correctly, because it's not public record, your assets. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, it's not public record.
Okay.
You wouldn't, unless you don't fund your trust properly. And it's, again, with the verbiage that we use around all of this, it's really inaccurate. Funding, one time a client said to me, well, how much is it? And is it an annual fee?
Right.
And I thought, you know what? She's not wrong to think that this is a fee, right, as a fund. But funding really means retitling your assets into the name of the trust.
Your bank account, your
brokerage
Roth
account.
IRA.
That would be your
that.
beneficiary designations. You would change those depending. Yes, people give different advice around, do you name your spouse first, your trust first, depending on the beneficiary designations.
Okay. But that's where service and expertise from a professional would come in, is you're going to help make the best recommendations or let them make the one thing I'll say about you is you gave me lots of information and I made the decision, but you gave me really good input to help me make an educated decision, which I think is what any professional should be doing. Anybody can make some decisions for you.
No, I think that's actually a really great point, because sometimes that's hard. That's a hard part of my job. Especially when it comes to like second marriages, third marriages, and there's children from previous marriages, and they want to give, all to the other spouse because they trust, going back to, I trust them to do the right thing.
Sure.
And again, I don't want to rely on trust, because trust is great, but life throws curveballs. They throw in, accidents and predators, creditors, divorce, bankruptcy, all the things, plus fallouts between the step parent and the children, especially once that parent has passed away.
Sure.
So once it goes to one parent, it can go that way out and not down. And when people don't take my advice and they say, I don't care, whatever, and it's hard for me. But again, as long as I've educated that client over what that might look like down the line, and they're fine with it, then I'm fine with it.
Sure.
But the education piece is so important to me.
Yeah, definitely. And what do we got next?
Well, number 2 was actually relying on probably and trust. And a lot of it is that, I recently reviewed a will that said I'm going to give everything outright to my sister, right? Just to put in her own little bank account to raise my 2-year-old if something happens to me, right? And because I trust her to raise my child and spend the money on my child. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. I love the fact that you're so close to your sister and trust your sibling. You know what I don't trust? I don't trust the fact that she's never going to get ill, and that money, number one cause of bankruptcy in the U.S. is medical bills. I don't trust the fact that she's never going to get married, because right away that person will have an elective share right in her assets. And also in a divorce, they might get some of that money. She might be in a car accident and sued. She might lose her job and need to live on that money. Right. Her house might burn down. I mean, I don't trust.
You don't know. Yeah.
I don't trust life. Like,
Life happens,
you can't trust. So I love the fact that she has such a close relationship with her sister. That's beautiful. And the fact that she has this person that she trusts to raise her daughter, but that isn't necessarily the best way to ensure that the money is going to be spent raising her daughter, right? That's really where you need to consider putting it in trust with her sister in charge of the trust and, in charge of the child. And by the way, the money and the guardianship doesn't have to be the same person. So that is sort of a built-in checks and balances if 2 different people are involved.
Right.
So that way there is no potential for, fudging the vacation.
Sure.
The whole family is going on versus, let's say just spending that, right. Just spending it on the child. And the money piece is super important. You mentioned how you've always have life insurance. I love to say that life insurance says, I love you. And it really is a way to say, I love you, whether all the types of insurance that we have out there, and there are so many, and of course, I don't sell insurance, but I certainly encourage everyone to have very comprehensive insurance, both for their business, their personal life, life insurance, health insurance, all of that, car, and be adequately insured. So it's not just about like, on paper, I have insurance. When somebody makes $500,000 a year and they come to me telling me they have $150,000 in term with a 5-year-old child, I'm sending them back to their agent. Because really at the end of the day, when you're picking guardians, and actually I have a guardianship guide that I have on my website, and I send it out with all the questionnaires to my clients so that they're very informed on the best way to pick guardians for their child. Because one of the things you don't want to do is pick based on money alone, because money is your job. Money as a parent, it's your job to be adequately insured and have the assets to get your child raised to 18 or 22 or whatever is important to you. So I think that's another piece, is sort of not relying just on trust or hope or someone else's ability.
Yeah. So if you don't have the cash, which, I really didn't have tons of assets until I really started getting into my late 30s and early 40s, just raising kids and money going out and starting a business. And so, but I had that life insurance piece, so you can, for $50 a month, or, I haven't shopped it in a while, but $60 a month, $100 a month, let's say, you can have the peace of mind of knowing that, hey, if something happens to me, there's going to be a pretty good chunk there that responsibly someone could deal with the kids for a while.
Yeah, and even pay your funeral expenses.
That too, yeah.
And actually a lot of people, depending, obviously right now we have a very high estate tax exemption. So, it's $12,920,000 per person. So people normally don't have an estate tax problem in this country. But if it ever goes down, or you do have that much, you can actually use insurance in fancy ways. To actually pay your estate tax. So insurance is really an incredible product that, can get pretty complicated. I know people who they're able to use it instead of a 529 to put their kids through college. You can borrow against it. There's all sorts of things, but certainly at a minimum, having a term life policy that's going to get your kids to where you want them to be able to go is really important. So I think that, again, not relying on trust or
goodwills, well wishes.
It's just
Good
it's
vibes.
so important. You do the planning. You had the baby.
Thoughts and prayers.
Thoughts and prayers. You had the baby. I am amazed how many people we just don't do that. It should be like you go to the OBGYN and find out you're having a baby. It should be like, here you go. Here's the guardian piece. Who is going to raise this child if you can't?
Sure.
And we just don't. We don't ever talk about it, really.
There's so many things, I think, coming back to what we talked about earlier. It's like there's just things you should know that you don't know a lot of times. And it's, shame on our country or schooling system or friends and to talk about these kind of things, because if they come up, they're major, they're massive issues when things happen. So But that's why we're here today. That's why we're making the time investment to get you up to speed on this. So that our next topic, going down the list, what are we at?
So the third sort of mistakes that people make when planning is using what's called poor man's estate planning techniques. And I did not make up that term.
Poor person. This is 2023.
True. Yes. Poor person's estate planning.
But it's kind of a well-known term, you know.
It is, and it's normally referring to when somebody deeds their house to their child. People think that that's a way to sort of protect their house from Medicaid spend down rules, or, you know, if they pass away, that they can avoid probate, or, you know, just a way to give their kid the house. And certainly had your mother, for example, done that, maybe we would have had a different outcome, but that's normally not the best way to do things. There are reasons for that. I mean, first of all, for Medicaid, I mean, there's look back periods and clawbacks, and if it hasn't been, you know, 5 or 6 years, it's very likely that the government can actually undo that gift or sale
to go after that
to
money.
you. Yeah, they're just gonna get the house back from you, especially if it's been gifted. But there's also a problem of once you put your child on the deed, you don't get that step up in basis at your mother's death. Let's call it your mother, right? At your mother's death, there would normally be a reset in that basis. So rather than the basis being what she paid for the house, potentially 50 years ago, it's now fair market value, right? If you get the house before that, it's going to be her basis that she had acquired it 50 years ago. So you, potentially when you do go to sell it, you're paying a much higher capital gains tax. So there's that. But also if you get married, again, you've got those elective shares, you get divorced, right? It's potentially, it's your asset.
Right.
So it's now available to creditors and, you know, spouses. You know, what if you have a falling out with your parent? So I never really recommend, you know, just outright giving it to your child. You know, you really have to think through some of the pitfalls that might again, you know, happen, right? We trust the kid, but I'm not going to rely on trust, right? As an attorney, it's my job to explain why trust is not a reliable thing to lean on. And the same thing goes for, you know, people say, well, I don't need to plan beyond these basics because I have a transfer on death or pay on death on my bank account. I've got power of attorney, no problem. I'm good to go. Banks don't like power of attorneys. They just don't. If they're a couple years old, you know, you might be able to get them to accept it, but more than 2-3 years old, they're going to say, go to court, get a court order. We don't want to accept it. There's just too many scams out there.
Scams. They probably have liability if they give that money away.
Absolutely. And if it turns out that, you know, especially the ones that are springing. So a springing document the power of attorney only comes into being if you have been declared incapacitated. Even doctors don't want to put their name to that. And they'll tell a family member, okay, you know, Brian cannot make his own decisions. Okay, can you put that in writing so I can have this power of attorney, you know, spring into action? And they say no because they have liability. Right. And then a lot of those documents are going to be drafted saying they want 2 licensed physicians. Good luck. You're talking about court, delay, expense, stress. Sure. So there's all these things that go into sort of drafting that you have to think through. If there are reasons for you to make it more difficult for someone to be able to, you know, be you out in the world, which is what really a power of attorney can do for someone, then we make it more difficult, right? If you're an 80-year-old who's married a 20-year-old who's just dying to, you know, get you to the point where they can access your money and you don't know
Does that happen?
You're probably...
I'm just kidding.
Yes, it does. Hopefully not too often, but it does happen, you know, or, you know, again, kids that are looking at every dollar spent on that medical bill is $1 out of their inheritance, right? I mean, there's all sorts of things that can come into play depending on the relationship that you have in your family and why estate planning is so personal and so unique and why, you know, cookie cutter template documents just don't work in today's environment. Because, you know, people say, well, why can't I just go to LegalZoom and just print it out myself? And I'm like, well, because that's a very boilerplate, probably the same type of document that was good 100 years ago. And just because it has a wherewithal, notwithstanding the foregoing moreover in it, doesn't mean that it's good legal language for the rest of that document.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's like, you know, there's some things you just get a professional. You know, I say this all the time, like, you know, if you make decent money, you shouldn't be changing your own oil. Sure, you can save yourself $10, which might be 20%. But at the end of the day, it's like the peace of mind that you get from the extra little bit that you spend. This is definitely one of those things you don't want to nitpick.
You don't want to DIY. But you also have to be, cognizant too of what advice you are getting, right? And I think that does lead us to number 4.
Yeah, right into
which
number 4.
is you don't go to a cardiologist for knee surgery. Mm-hmm. Would you? I would not.
No.
Right? And they're surgeons. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And they probably had to do some kind of ortho surgery in medical school at some point, but you just know better. You're going to go to the person who does knees all day. Mm-hmm. And if you need heart surgery, you're going to go to the cardiologist. And lawyers, I think traditionally, and we see this probably in TV and movies, lawyers are portrayed as sort of, jack of all trades. And, oh, you're a lawyer, you'll know. And just like I wouldn't defend someone for murder, I don't think a criminal attorney really should be drafting estate plans. And they do. And I've seen the estate plans. One particular one not that long ago, I even asked the client, well, why did you make some of these decisions? And they said, I don't know. We talked to the lawyer for 5 minutes. He printed it out and we signed it. So there was really no... And that's not malpractice, by the way. They're allowed to do that. They went to law school, they have a law degree, and they've got some template that they probably got online or from the bar. And they don't care if it works or not, because it's a legal document and they've executed it properly. If your family has trouble down the line, it's not their problem, right? And if anything, the lawyer who has to take you to court is going to make money off of that. Mm-hmm. And, my whole thing is I hate court. I don't like stress. And my whole thing is that I want you to sleep better at night. And for me, my job is to keep your family out of court and out of conflict as much as you want to be kept out of court. Because some people say, I don't care about going to probate, or I don't care if, I'm making choices that are probably going to lead to conflict. Then fine. But I'm going to educate you on what that conflict might look like down the line. And there was a study not that long ago about the burden on families after the death of a loved one and going through probate. And it was something crazy, like 4 family members, 26 hours a month. And it can take a year, in some states, 1.5 years to get through probate. Our state's about a year. Well, every county's different, but let's call it Wake County. We say 6 to 12 months, but obviously with COVID, it kind of slowed things down.
Yeah, sure.
Lost revenue, that those 4 family members, so they're not doing as good a job at their own job. Mm-hmm. So now their jobs are at risk, right? Or they're stressed out, and also their mental health, right? So they have more anxiety and depression. So these are things that are not necessarily financial burdens on the family. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, they're also grieving your death,
right?
So it's just not a good idea, I think, to leave it up to sort of who cares, I'm dead. And I definitely hear people say that, who cares, I'm dead. I recently spoke with 2 people, one totally opposite outcomes. One of them said the best thing my mother ever did was plan. We had 5 children. She had everything in a box, so organized, best thing she ever did. So we were able to really grieve her. We knew exactly where everything was, what she had, what she wanted, and we're still very close. And another woman said, I'm one of 7. My mother left it to 1/7 to each child, period. So she had a will, 1/7 to each child. And this, again, is where maybe a lawyer might have helped sort of flesh that out a little bit.
Fine-tune some of that.
Well, 1/7, but when it's not money that you can just split into 7ths and it's stuff, they're fighting. And they used to have family dinners every Sunday, and now they only communicate through attorneys. That's heartbreaking to me. That is something that woman did not want for her children. Right. In her mind, they were still having family dinners every Sunday after her passing, and that's not the case. And how do you repair that damage down the line?
You probably don't.
It definitely becomes difficult. So that to me is, I think, the most important piece is you go to someone who does this, that's their niche. All the reading that I do, all the continuing education that I do, right? It's really all about estate planning, because estate planning is an interesting field. It's like a puzzle, because you have the client and all their moving pieces, their family, their hopes, their dreams, their wants, their assets, their concerns, which is a huge part, right? Because I want to solve your concerns, not necessarily mine or the next guy's.
Sure.
But then you also have all the laws. So you have your estate planning laws, and then you also have your tax laws, your income tax law. I mean, there's just so many taxes that come into play, and the estate, the sort of assets and the probate laws and trust laws and fiduciary laws. And so to me, I love it, because there's always these moving parts, and for a lifelong learner, is there's always more to learn and always more to do. So it can get pretty, I call it sexy, but other people might not.
Yeah. A lot of reading, a attorney stuff. But I mean, when you think about it, it's just, and I know you wouldn't say this, like I wouldn't talk about, bad scenarios from home invasions. We just don't talk about that kind of stuff with clients. But I just, to me, it's one of those things you're just kind of selfish. And I know you're not going to say that, and I wouldn't in your situation, but I just think if you're not leaving a peaceful scenario the best you can, I would hate to think about my kids fighting over stuff, number one, but a lot of times it might be, hey, you want the house, I just want my portion of the funds from it, but you can't afford to buy the house, to buy me out. So how's that dealt with? Mm-hmm. There's all those little things to work out that when you deal with a professional like yourself, obviously you can help think down the line. And that's one of the several things, and without putting my personal stuff out there, but you got me thinking about several things down the line that it's like, oh, now that you mentioned that, it's like that does change things. Let me change how I'm thinking about that a little bit. So, really important. And then,
you mentioned your mom's house earlier, and that's something that comes up, especially with, houses that have been in the family for a long time. Mm-hmm. That happened with a friend who the mother passed away and the dad started spending like crazy, literally giving the money away to the prince in Ghana. Mm. And she had consulted going back again to, go to the right attorney. She went to a criminal attorney and said, how can I stop my dad from, he kind of lost his mind, after my mom died, how can I stop him? And the lawyer said he's not committing any crimes. And that just, that killed me, because what she could have done was try to get, that guardianship over his estate, right? Because there's guardianship over the person and then there's the estate, so that she could have been in charge of the finances where he couldn't just spend willy-nilly. Mm-hmm. And what ended up happening was he actually went to Ghana. I mean, thank God he wasn't kidnapped.
Jeez.
Mm-hmm. He actually went to Ghana and they took all the money. He literally lost the family farm. And then you see that with second homes, right? Mm-hmm. Second homes. So how do you keep a vacation home in the family? Because you're right. One person says, I can't afford it. It needs a new roof. I don't want to afford it. I use it more weeks than you. So there are ways to handle that. And that's something I love helping families with, is sort of, okay, how are you going to keep this vacation home in the family where everybody is getting along and there's a fund in place to handle repairs, handle rentals, handle sharing, because that's an important piece.
Or I would say at a minimum that, just speaking personally, how I would handle it, like I'm going to tell the kids, this is what I'm going to do. It's my decision. It's my property. I want you guys to have the proceeds, but I'm going to do X, or I'm going to implement this. So I want to take all the arguing out the best I can, going forward.
But if you've passed away,
well, that I'm gonna maybe could we put it in the trust that home is to be sold?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So something like that.
But then you're not trying to keep it in the family. Very different, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, your stuff, you can sell it.
But yeah. But long story short, that's why you have a pro to help out.
And then going to number 5, we're finally there. I think price. How much does it cost? Right? Mm-hmm. So basing your planning based solely on cost versus value and outcome. I think that when you do go to a professional, what you're really paying for is the advice, the guidance, and the outcome of keeping your family intact and out of court and out of conflict, and minimizing. Of course, you can't eliminate, right, stress and grief.
Sure.
But sort of, giving the space to create the space where they can actually go through those stages of grieving without all this extra, garbage, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes I wonder when people say, well, how much does it cost? It's like, well, let me explain what this is and what you get for it. And then you can decide the value. It reminds me of, car shopping. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, if you see the jalopy and the door's not even the same color as the rest of the car, you're not expecting the same driving experience as like somebody pulls up with a brand new SUV.
Right.
But it's a car and it gets you from point A and point B, but it's a very, very, very different experience. And it's the same thing with, having a really comprehensive well thought out, well drafted plan that is going to work when your family needs it and be updated. Because one of the really important things is to make sure that you're evaluating your plan every few years. I build in a 3-year review, but I always tell my clients, call me if you have a baby, move, buy something. I mean, you don't have to wait for the 3 years. Right. But I also have people say to me, I have a 16-year-old will from New Jersey, didn't have any kids when I drafted it. Is it still good? Number one question I ask is, have you ever heard from that lawyer? And the answer is always no. And it always shocks me, really, because again, it's not a set it and forget it, one and done, put it on a shelf and let it collect dust thing. Estate planning, that's again why I'm saying there's the language around it is all wrong. It's really about you creating something that is ever changing, ever moving. The laws are ever changing. Your life is ever changing. And so just you're really paying for the outcome. And at that 3-year review, I'm also creating new powers of attorney because again, if it's more than a few years old, the bank's not going to accept it.
Right.
So why not refresh those documents automatically? Because that's the only way that they're ever going to work.
Sure.
If they'll work at all, like if the banks can accept it at all, but you
Right.
hope. But really, it's more than price. There are ways to afford a professional, right? Now they even have something called client credit. It's sort of like care credit that you would, if you needed a root canal, right? You're probably not going to the person working in a back alley who is just, going to hit you over the head and
Right.
you know what I mean? You're going to go to the
$50,
professional who has experience, who knows what they're doing and is going to do it right.
Right.
And you're going to get that care credit to pay for it,
Right.
over time. So there are ways to afford the better, more comprehensive plan. And I call it, luxury affordability or whatever it's,
And
you expect.
I'm not looking for any additional charges, but I thought it was extremely reasonable with what you quoted and what I felt like I received for you personally. But at the end of the day, that's always, we deal with this in the security industry. It's like people call it, well, what's your monitoring rate? It's like, that's really not the best question. It's a factor. Price is always a factor, but people make the worst decisions based on price. You got to get the information. You got to compare apples to apples. You got to get the details and understand the differences between getting a document online and dealing with a pro or talking security. You order some garbage off the internet, and it's just not the same thing. It's not even remotely close to what we do. So there's parallels with that across everything, right?
Totally. And like you said, one time, it's like, well, when you have that security system, someone can come in, grab it off the wall, short it in the toilet, and you're good to go. And it's like, oh, I didn't even know that. And the same thing goes for the will. People think, well, I have a will. I'm good.
Right.
They don't think about, is that will going to work when your family needs it? Is that really the best choice? I ask sometimes when someone has a plan, I will review it for them. And I'll say, what does it say before I read it? And they'll tell me. And oftentimes it is not what it says. And it blows my mind that what they want to have happen, the outcome they want, the outcome they think they're going to get has nothing to do with what they actually have on paper. And so it's really, really important. That's again, to review it, to see. And I'm always really happy when someone wants me to review it. If someone has a plan and I review it and it's really what they want and it's still good, I'm going to be honest.
Sure.
And I'll be actually really happy, to be honest. It's really because I really care about whether or not someone has a good plan that's going to work. And if you do, I don't need to sell you a new plan. Right. You might want to update some of the, as I said, some of those legal documents. A hospital is much more likely to take an older healthcare power of attorney than a bank, right, with the money, because just, again, the liability and the scams and things.
Sure.
But it really is important to just constantly make sure that it still works for your family. What worked for your children at 6 years old may not work at 16. The idea of sending your child off to your sibling in California at 16 after their parents were just killed or died, right? You have to think through some of what that looks like.
Definitely don't want to send it to California. I grew up there for the record.
I went to law school there. I know. I laugh. I'm like with the 4 seasons of fire, mud, earthquakes, and drought.
5.5 earthquake. You want to leave California pretty quickly.
Yeah, I went through some of those.
But I just did a video for our customers. It's a follow-up video to new installations that Raphael's going to be working on soon. But I made a statement in there. I really believe this. It's like, it's my job as an ethical business owner to try to set the expectation the best I can. It's your job as a consumer to understand what you just did and what you just signed up for. and understand the differences and why you signed up or why you went with this way versus another way. So, if you don't take a little bit of time to invest in something as important as a living will and a understanding your options, that's a big mistake. And I'm sure you'd agree, obviously. Yeah.
People think that they're hard to read. I think that's another misconception about the law, right? Well, I've literally had people say, well, you've read it. That's good enough for me, like for their own plan. And I'm like, yeah, but go ahead and read it. My documents, I make them, they're first person, your will, your trust, they're in first person about my family, my assets, my trustee, my executor, so that it's readable for you. And that someone else who is in charge of your assets or your children after can really understand what it is that you wanted the outcome to be. And I would say, go ahead and read it. And if you have a question, call me, because I try to minimize the legalese. Sometimes you do have to use certain language, to be specific. But
Jeni, I appreciate you sharing this stuff with us today. And what's the best way to contact you if people want more information?
I think the best way is to go to the website and see sniderlaw.com. Snider is with an I,
okay,
as we know. There is some information there, more information about how I work with clients, and also a way to book a 15-minute consultation, which is really the best way to get started. So I can learn a little bit more about you, and I can share a little bit more about my firm and how I work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for dedicating your time today and sharing with us. And until next time, have a great day, and see you next time on the 5 Things Podcast. Hello, this is Brian Smith, and thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more valuable content.